Listener discretion is advised.
True crime can be strangely fascinating. This true crime is odd, macabre, and haunted. I'm Diane, your guide into the shadows. Welcome to Phantasmal Crime. The Florida Everglades is a network of impenetrable swamps, snaking waterways, and thick cypress forests. This would be a great place to make a body disappear, and there is a dark history here of disappearances, death, and hauntings. Conservative numbers claim that there have been 175 unsolved murders here since 1965. People claim that the Everglades is haunted, and there are stories going back to the times of the earliest settlers here, the Calusa tribe, that speak of a dark energy and power. Some might say that Native American tribes tell stories of places having an evil essence, but that they are just that, stories. But what do we make of the ramblings of one of the most heinous serial killers of all time, Henry Lee Lucas? Lucas claimed that an occultist group known as the Hand of Death used the Everglades as a meeting place for practicing rituals and had some kind of paramilitary training camp there. He joined the group and made what may have been his first murder under the direction of the Hand of Death. They had him enter the tent of a drunken member, and Lucas claims he slashed the man's throat. Lucas was known to tell a tall tale, and authorities believe that he inflated his kill numbers greatly. So it's possible that he just made this up. But apparently it was his partner in crime, Otis Toole, that brought him into the group. So apparently Toole also claimed that this Hand of Death was in the Everglades. It wasn't just Lucas and Toole that claimed the cult existed. Charles Manson and the Son of Sam also did. Stories about the cult and camp claim that there were several hundred students from 6 different countries at the camp. They would drink the blood of victims and sometimes eat some of the flesh and burn bodies on altars. Evening recreation would include alcohol, drugs, and orgies. Part of the duties assigned to members were kidnapping children for sex trafficking or use in sacrificial ceremonies. Police did search the Everglades and never found evidence of the cult. Lucas maintained until his death that the Everglades was a place of true evil, that it was a place similar to the Crossroads, a place one goes to meet the devil. The biblical devil may not reside in the Everglades, but a devilish man once did. Everglades City is the gateway to Everglades National Park. The Calusa were an indigenous people who made these mangrove islands habitable by packing them with shells to create solid ground. This ground came to be known as the 10,000 Islands. One of these was Chokoloskee Island. This was a harsh environment where people plastered themselves in mud to keep the mosquitoes from biting. Sugar farmers were able to plant here with success, though, so the area soon populated with farmers and migrant farm workers. This also was a great place for outlaws to hide out. One of those outlaws was Edgar Watson. He arrived in the 1880s and built a cabin atop one of the sacred shell mounds on Chokoloskee Island. He was originally from South Carolina and had spent time out west. Rumors claim that Watson was on the run from the law for murder, and not just the murder of anyone. Although the case remains unsolved today, historians believe that Watson killed infamous outlaw Belle Starr. Belle Starr was associated with Jesse James and other Wild West outlaws. Watson had shown up in Oklahoma and she leased some land to him. Shortly after that, she got hauled in before a judge who put her on parole, but warned her that she would get jail time if she was found to be hanging out with any outlaws. Starr knew she needed to get rid of Watson because he had a warrant out for his arrest in Florida where he had killed someone. Watson was a jerk and decided to get back at Starr, so he shot her in the back one day when she was riding into town on a horse. She died instantly. Somehow, the grand jury voted that Watson was not guilty, and he returned to Florida. Watson spent his time hunting exotic birds for their plumage, raising hogs, and growing sugar cane. When he would come to town for supplies, people generally avoided him as he gave off a bad energy. He was eccentric and always wore a dark overcoat and kept his back to the wall. He rarely spoke to anyone, usually only offering the most basic greeting. There were signs that he had a violent nature. He once got in a drunken brawl with another landowner and slit his throat, nearly killing him. He paid the man $900 to drop his complaint, and no charges were pressed against Watson. Despite living on a remote island, people in town did keep tabs on the workings of the Watson plantation. They noticed that Watson made it a practice to hire migrant workers to help him in his prosperous sugarcane business. They couldn't help but observe that each year there would be a new crop of workers, almost as if the other workers had disappeared. In 1910, a group of boys were traveling by boat near the Watson plantation when they saw something unusual in the water. As they approached, they realized that it was the disemboweled body of a woman. They went back to town, and several men retrieved the body and realized that it was a woman who worked for Watson. A small posse of men made the trip out to the plantation, but when they knocked on the door, they were told that Watson was not there. They started to leave when they noticed several places where earth was disturbed. The men decided to dig because they had a feeling they would find more bodies. And they did. Around 40 of them. It would seem that Watson would kill the workers at the end of the season rather than pay them. The next day, when the men found Watson, he told them he believed a man he had brought down to be his foreman, Leslie Cox, was responsible for the murders. He said he would take care of the problem since he had hired the man. Later, Watson arrived in town on his boat and was met by several men standing on the dock of the general store with shotguns. He explained to them that he took Cox out in his boat and shot him and then threw his body into the murky waters. Now, a former worker had told these men that he had witnessed Watson killing workers and gutting them so that their bodies would sink more easily into the swamp, and that the swamp was literally littered with bodies. When Watson got off his boat, he pulled out a revolver and was quickly loaded up with bullets. The corpse was tied to the back of a small boat and dragged through the swamp to nearby Rabbit Key, where it was dumped unceremoniously into a pit and buried. The sheriff dug up the body later and found 33 gunshot wounds. Watson was then buried at Fort Myers Cemetery. Watson's place is now a historic site, but the house is in ruins. Nothing would grow on the farm after Watson's death. A legend claims that a woman who lived in the house was tortured by haunting spirits there and finally burned the place to the ground. Another story claims that rangers burned the cabin down in 1960. It is thought that both Watson and his victims haunt the area, and it's no wonder since no one knows for sure that Watson was indeed a serial killer, and many of the victims' bodies are still probably buried in the alligator-infested swamp. Edgar Watson actually had a wife and a daughter. He had a grandson who reputedly wrote the following letter that lends credence to the story that his grandfather's spirit still haunts this place. It's dated 11/22/1997. Dear old friend, the most peculiar thing happens to a person once they've entered the city limits of Everglades City, Florida. It is almost as if that proverbial black cloud just suddenly hovers over your head. Only it's not a black cloud, it's more like a big black hat. Of course, only one man in 10,000 Islands history can ever get away with wearing that black hat. That man was Edgar J. Watson. Who's Edgar J. Watson, you ask? Why, he is only the most infamous man in Chokoloskee history. The oddest thing is that he has been dead since 1910, or so they say, but I'll tell you, Mr. Watson will live on forever. Just let me tell you a tale of how even today, in 1997, Ed Watson makes his presence felt all over these islands. It must have been about 3 weeks ago when these dang college kids come west from Dade to visit the Smallwood store and take a little boat tour of the islands. Well, I can tell you, that ain't no college education sinking into them. They should have known that it was going to be a bad day when all that rain come down even before 9 o'clock. It all started when they got to Ted's old store about 10 in the morning. You see, there they were all wet and eager to hear about Mr. Watson's life on Chatham Bend. Now, I've been in Chokoloskee all my life, and I've seen so many city slickers come in and out of that there store, it'll make your head spin. I'm certain that old Ted must be turning in his grave as he watches all them people come in and out of his store. Well, soon enough, them kids sat down in the southwest corner of the store where they got all of Toch's videos playing. So the kids sit there and listen to their guest lecturer as he starts talking about the life and times of E.J. Watson. About halfway through the lecture, I meander my way through their sitting area and head out the back door. But as I'm walking, I make eye contact with one of them kids. He was a fat feller. Must have been at least 200 plus pounds. But that ain't the only reason I laid eyes on him. You see, I looked at him because as I strolled through, I noticed that he couldn't take his slanty little eyes off of that picture of Mr. Watson and Mrs. Watson and lovely young Carrie. Right then and there I knew he was the one. You see, every once in a while a tourist will come through Everglades City and do everything there is to do here. And every other once in a while there's a tourist who'll come through and never leave. His body may leave, but his heart and soul will be here forever. And if you're wondering where his heart and soul will be, it'll be at that beautiful white plantation home on Chatham Bend. Everyone says that EJ died that day in 1910, but I sure as heck don't believe a word they say. I've been here all my life, and I know what I've seen. I have seen with my own two eyes a man with auburn hair and a broad black hat covered in a dark overcoat walking through the streets and riding a skiff out in them entangled islands. Now the funny thing is, this figure always has his back to me, so I can't tell you it's Mr. Watson for sure, but the betting man would definitely put his money on Edgar J. Watson. The most unusual thing about the dark figure is that he only appears when some tourist has something unfortunate happen to him. I swear that I'd seen EJ that same morning before that class came into town. I seen him out on Chokoloskee Bay grinning his way into them lush tropical islands. Anyhow, them kids went for lunch out towards what is now the Everglades National Park Visitor Center. They all ate their lunches except for that fat feller. They ate anything from sandwiches to fruit to yogurt, and not one bit of all that food touched the lips of that plump boy. You see, it had already begun. EJ was playing with his mind. Back in the store, the kid couldn't take his eyes off of Ed because Ed wouldn't take his eyes off of him. It was as if Mr. Watson had said something to the boy that no one else heard. Well, once EJ has got their attention, he makes sure to never lets it go. About 2 o'clock, them kids got on one of them boats and head out on the bay towards all them mysterious islands. And yes, that kid still looked all dazed and confused. Sure enough, they docked on Sandfly Key around 3 o'clock, and it was then that I knew it was all over for this feller. Halfway into that deep green trail on Sandfly Key, the other kids claimed they heard something like a buckshot out of a double-barrel shotgun. Now, if that wasn't enough to scare the daylights out of them, they noticed that the fat kid was gone. At first, they figured he was just pulling some wild prank, but soon enough, they began to worry that maybe he was lost out there in the wilderness. So they set up a search party to see if they could find him before dark. The only thing worse than being lost in the 10,000 islands is being lost in the 10,000 islands at night. Just about when they'd given up, the rangers and others heard a scream. It'd come from just about where that patch of cactus was growing. There he was. The other kids say that when they found him, he was sucking on his thumb and his cap had been knocked off his head. One of the rangers told me that cap was so full of buckshot holes that it reminded him of a block of Swiss cheese. Now, I saw that fat feller as he left this place, and let me assure you that E.J. Watson got to him. They had to call an ambulance for that boy. One of the rangers told me that the boy was still in a catatonic phase, and the doctor said they can't tell when he'll come out. And if you ask me, there ain't no way that boy's ever coming back out. Why, you ask? Well, because E.J. Watson has got his heart and soul down there on Chatham Bend. Later that night, I could have sworn I heard a deep chuckle coming from those islands, and I'll bet you anything that it was Mr. Watson laughing at his newest addition to the plantation. Now, I can't tell you why it is that Edgar J. Watson still haunts the 10,000 Islands area, but my guess is that he just is taking care of some unfinished business and loving every minute of it. Please make sure that you take care of yourself and your kin if you ever come to Everglades City, because Mr. Watson may just be waiting for you. Sincerely, Little Robbie Watson. P.S. I guarantee you that Grandpa is just fine. The store in town that Watson shopped at was Smallwood's store, and it's still there. Today it runs as a museum, and there are claims of hauntings here that include seeing a dark figure to cold spots to disembodied voices. Neighbors often let the owners know that they have seen people moving about in the store when no one should be in there. Mallory McMillan is the great-granddaughter of Ted Smallwoods, and she runs the museum. She said, "I've been here my whole life. Sometimes when I'm closing up and I get all the doors and stuff closed, I don't know, it feels kind of creepy, like there's someone standing behind me sometimes." Another legend from this area claims that a ghost pirate ship roams the waters. The story goes that a merchant vessel was trying to evade a pirate ship, but was finally captured. The pirates put every crewman aboard the vessel to death except the wife of the skipper. The poor woman was forced to witness all the men being killed. She pleaded with God to bring down a curse on the pirates. Almost instantly, a tidal wave pushed the pirate ship inland within the maze of rivers and channels of the Everglades. The pirate ship was hopelessly lost, and there have been numerous reports of people claiming to see the spectral ship. It is described as a ghostly, rusted hulk with tattered sails that is drifting aimlessly. Are the Everglades really home to a menacing force? Or has death come to the Everglades and found a good place to rest? Are there spirits at unrest among the mangroves and islands? Are the Florida Everglades haunted? That is for you to decide. Thanks so much for listening to History Goes Bump's Phantasmal Crime. If you'd like to share with us a haunted crime that you've heard about, please write us at historygoesbump@gmail.com. I've been your host, Diane. Join me on the next episode for another trip through the shadows. This has been a production of History Goes Bump podcast.